Good evening. Dear Mr. Ambassadors, dear Professor Snyder, dear guests, colleagues, and friends. It's really a great honor. We are very happy to open this event and this conference, Ukraine Thinking Together, Мислити з Україною, which was initiated by Professor Snyder and the colleagues, is very important for us, for the whole Ukraine, for Kyiv Mohila Academy and all universities in our country. And it is a pleasure for me to let Professor Snyder open this event, and just maybe it's not necessary here in Kyiv today, after all events of Maidan and very important publications in the New Republic and important newspapers, the paper and the books of Timothy Snyder. Everybody knows Bloodlands, and already translated in Ukrainian. Also the Reconstruction of Nation, also translated in Ukrainian, Перетворення націй by Дух і Літера in Kyiv Mohila Academy. And in the introduction, the very beginning of this book, I like very much the symbol of icebreaker. And not only important monographies and narrative in a book, but also a public lecture, as today. You know the topic, not even past, Ukrainian histories, Russian politics, European futures. So public lecture can be compared with an icebreaker, which confronts the icy surface of mythologies and propaganda. So, dear Professor Snyder, you are welcome to take the floor.
Dobrý večer. Jak bude anglickою mовою говорити? Всі готові? Дуже добре. Я не мав часу писати українською мовою, тому що англійською. В порядку? Так? Це дуже гарна мова і легка, я просто не мав часу. Okay. The lecture is titled Not Even Past. And this is a quotation, of course, from the American writer William Faulkner, from Requiem for a Nun. The past is not over. It's not even past. What I would like to reflect upon today is the way that the European history of Ukraine, the European past of Ukraine, exists in political matrices, exists in the political discussions of modernity. I'm going to say a very quick word, about something you all know, that is to say, about the European history of Ukraine. And then I will try to develop an argument about how the European history of Ukraine mattered as the national way of seeing the world came to be prominent, and then say a word about how the European history of Ukraine matters as Europe itself becomes the way that we think about the past. So, it's controversial where I come from, but you all know that Ukraine has a European history. in fact, it's a very typical European history. The beginnings of Ukrainian history, or the beginnings of Kievan Rus, in a confrontation between Vikings and local peoples. This is central to the history of France. It's central to the history of Great Britain. These are Central European themes. The next stage in the history of Kievan Rus, the confrontation between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, the various bargains, the various betrayals that were made in Kyiv, as in Warsaw, as in Prague, as in Bulgaria, as East European leaders oscillated between Rome and Byzantium, trying to find the best possible bargain. This is also a very typical European story. After the end of Rus, the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is, I think, the step in Ukrainian history which is most often forgotten. It's forgotten in Lithuania, it's forgotten in the West, is a very interesting stage, because it is in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania that the Kievan inheritance is preserved. The Kievan language, the language of state, also the Kievan law code, these things are preserved precisely in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The next stage in the European history of Ukraine is, of course, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth after 1569, after the Union of Lublin. The Union of Lublin is a very important moment because it draws a line between what is now Belarus and what is now Ukraine for the first time in history. Ukrainian territories fall into the Polish crown, the rest falls into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And it is during this period, the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that the history of Ukraine is, so to say, most recognizably European. This is the period when we see a Renaissance, a Reformation, a Counter-Reformation, all of these nice things. It's a period when we see a republic. The specialty of Polish history at this moment is that Polish history recreates all the things that it didn't really have. So Polish history has a Renaissance, but it didn't ever have a Naissance, right? There's a Renaissance, but there's no classical history in Poland, but there is a Renaissance, all the same. And Ukraine takes part in that Renaissance. Poland calls itself a republic. It has no ancient republic traditions, but it refers to them all the same. Ukraine is part of that republic. But within that republic, we have a very important tension, and a tension which is worth recalling, I think, today. The tension is between the very few Ukrainians, the magnates, the great aristocrats, the magnateria, who did extremely well in this republic, and the vast majority of the population that did not. And so the rebellion which is against the rulers of Ukraine, the rebellion against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is in fact against the rulers of Ukraine, is a rebellion against inequality. It's a rebellion on behalf of people who are excluded from the system, people who call themselves Cossacks. It's a very important moment in Ukraine's European history, but it's also the moment when a certain stage of that history breaks down. Because as you all know, the Cossacks find themselves in alliance with Muscovy. The Cossacks then find themselves under Muscovy, and after 1667, this city and all of right bank Ukraine finds itself under Muscovy and under the Russian Empire. It's a very important turning point because from 1667 onwards until, let's say, about 2 decades ago, the elites from this city primarily moved northwards to Moscow. Now, that is a very short sketch of a certain history. In the 19th century, all Europeans, not just Ukrainians or Poles or Russians, but all Europeans had to remake their history in a national form. That was the dominant spirit, the dominant ethos of the day. Everyone had a complicated history which was reshaped, remade, reconstructed, as Konstantin was nice enough to refer to my book, reconstructed as a new sort of history, as a national sort of history. And here too, it's striking how typical Ukraine is. The move to romanticism, to populism that begins in Kharkiv, which spreads to Kyiv, and then to Lviv. Lviv was actually at the end of this, and not at the beginning, is very typically European. The idea that you have to move history away from the elites and in Eastern Europe, away from the state, and towards the people and their language and their stories and their songs, is quintessentially European. It's something which is absolutely typically European. It begins in Germany, it spreads elsewhere. Now, what's worth noticing here, and this is a crucial moment too, is that Ukrainian romanticism, Ukrainian populism, the move in Ukrainian history to put the people at the center of the story, is primarily against the history of the Commonwealth. It's primarily against Poles, or Poles identified, as Shevchenko put it, as the aristocrats and the priests. Populism is directed against the Western neighbor, and thus in some sense against Europe. And this is a very important tendency to watch play out. In other words, Ukrainian patriots, or people who were identifying with the Ukrainian-speaking population, always had at least two problems. They had the problem of the Russian Empire, and they had the problem of Poland. And from the point of view of the 18th and 19th century, you could make an argument about which of these was Europe, right? You can certainly make an argument that St. Petersburg was Europe. You could also make an argument that Warsaw was Europe. But in both cases, they seem to be a problem. And this is a development which we're going to watch. Okay. So these tensions, the multiple problems that Ukrainian patriots faced, the multiple problems that Ukrainian state builders faced, become apparent in 1914. 1914 is a moment where I would say things start to become very unusual. Thus far, I've emphasized how typically European Ukrainian history is. In 1914, something unusual happens. The First World War in Eastern Europe, and now I'm going to lose all of my Polish and Czech and Romanian friends. The First World War in Eastern Europe is generally a moment when you do nothing for statehood, but you get it anyway, right? There went my chance to write, Polish history textbooks. But in general, there's very little connection between how hard you fight for national independence and whether you get national independence, right? So Romania, does very little in the First World War, but it gets a lot of territory. Czechoslovakia, right? The Czechs and the Slovaks are fighting on the wrong side, but they get an entirely new state. The Polish movement for independence exists, but it's very minor, and nevertheless an entirely new Polish state is created, and so on and so on, right? In general, you don't have to do very much. Serbia started the war. The war was Serbia's fault, and yet Serbia ends the war as the central part of a much bigger state, Yugoslavia. So, but the Ukrainian case here is atypical. After the war, many Ukrainians do fight for independence. There are two major efforts to create a Ukrainian state. One based in Kyiv, one based in Galicia. All of you already know this. There are a huge number of casualties on the part of people fighting for Ukrainian independence. Kyiv eastward and then all the way back to Warsaw, in fact. As you probably know, there are a good number of Ukrainian soldiers buried in Polish military cemeteries in Warsaw because they were fighting all the way back to Warsaw in August of 1919. So here you have this unusual situation. You have a lot of conflict, a lot of people who are dying to create a state, but at the end of it, no state. At the end of it, the failure to create a state. The failure to create a state because the Russian whites are against this, because the Poles only support it very late and within certain boundaries, but ultimately because it's the Red Army that wins this very complicated civil war. Now, this brings me to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet period in Ukrainian history is extremely interesting. It's extremely interesting because the victory of the Red Army, the creation of the Soviet Union, casts the question of Ukraine and Europe in an entirely new way. Because, after all, the Soviet Union, and there are many things to say about the Soviet Union, I'm just going to focus on one aspect here. The Soviet Union was, among many other things, an attempt to recreate Europe. The premise of the Soviet Union was, we are a backward country, we need to recreate capitalism, that is to say, Europe, in order to surpass it later on. Right? That is the premise of the Soviet Union. The second premise of the Soviet Union is that nations exist, although maybe not forever. So the Soviet Union is established as a state which is going to try to create something that looks like capitalism in order to go past capitalism, and as something which has interior national boundaries in order eventually to transcend them, to go beyond them. So a Ukrainian republic is created inside the Soviet Union. Now, I know it's easy to dismiss this reality. It's easy to say the Soviet Union was just very repressive. And of course it was, and I've written about that. But there's something here to be understood, that we have to understand before we get to the end of the story. And that is the way that Europe was both a model and an enemy at the same time in the Soviet Union, and the way that this was most intense in the case of Ukraine. Europe is a model because the entire Soviet Union has to catch up to Europe, but it's also an enemy because it's capitalist. And this ambivalence is most intense in Ukraine because Ukraine is, of course, the western frontier of the Soviet Union. It's the big republic which has a long border with Poland and Romania, therefore with Europe. So in the 1920s, in this very interesting period of affirmative action for Ukrainians within the Soviet Union, of the subsidization of Ukrainian culture, of the support of Ukrainian modernism and futurism, you see this tension be resolved. Because yes, a new generation of Ukrainian writers and artists and even historians grows up within the Soviet Union, making very interesting art, writing very good novels, carrying out very good scholarship. But they are generally pro-European. And now this is a story that you know. Somewhere around 1928, 1929, 1930, it's no longer all right to be in favor of Europe. Especially after January of 1930, when collectivization begins in earnest, and peasants resist collectivization in Soviet Ukraine massively. From that point forward, something turns. Europe is no longer seen as a model. It's no longer acceptable to be pro-European. Instead, all of the problems of collectivization, including the famine, are now blamed on Europe. I don't know how closely the rest of you have read this propaganda. I've spent a long time with it. The idea is expressed that the famine in Ukraine is the fault of Poland, because Polish agents are paying Ukrainian nationalists inside the Ukrainian Communist Party and so on. And then at a slightly later stage, after the famine has happened, the discussions of the famine are blamed on Nazi Germany. So if you mention that there was a famine in Soviet Ukraine, this means, according to Soviet propaganda, that you were an agent of Nazi Germany. Now, this is a very interesting moment, of course. I mean, it's a horrible moment. It's a terrible moment. But it's an interesting moment for our story of Europe and European futures, because it's at this moment that the dichotomy, the Manichaean absolute opposition between fascism and anti-fascism is created, where anti-fascism, where anti-fascism is everything good and fascism is everything bad. It's at this moment, right, that the association of Ukraine with fascism begins, even before the war. It's at this moment when this very powerful political logic is established. So the way I would describe the 1930s and the 1940s in Ukrainian history would be that Ukraine becomes something like an object. Ukraine becomes something like an object of the grand projects of European history. Ukraine becomes something which is a target, something which is to be transformed, something which is at the receiving end. It is, I mean, to put it in a slightly dramatic way, which I think is true, it is the object of European style colonization. This is, in any event, how Stalin described it. When Stalin described the first 5-year plan, the project of collectivization, as internal colonization. We have no external colonies, I quote Comrade Stalin. Unlike the Western powers, we have no external colonies. Therefore, we must colonize ourselves, which means very precisely exploiting the peasants and exploiting the lands. That's one model of colonization. A second model of colonization comes from Nazi Germany. The idea of Lebensraum, the idea of living space that we all know, has a precise geography. The precise geography of Lebensraum is Ukraine. Like Stalin, Hitler understood Ukraine as a breadbasket. He understood it as a place that could feed an entire continent. The question was just which continent that was going to be. Whereas Stalin presented Ukraine as the territory that must be controlled if the Soviet Union was going to survive the world capitalist conspiracy, Hitler presented Ukraine as the territory which must be controlled if Germany was going to survive the world Jewish conspiracy. So in both cases, there is a regional colony which has to be mastered, which has to be controlled in the service of a slightly lunatic but very coherent ideology about the way the world actually works. Or to put it in more technical terms, there was a territory which had to be controlled if you wanted to be a world power, whether you were in Berlin or whether you were in Moscow. Now, the Germans looked at collective farming, and they saw it as a positive model. The German planners assumed that they were going to keep the collective farms in Ukraine as a means of controlling the population and of controlling the food supply. Their idea was that they would extract the food from Ukraine and use it to feed Germany and Western Europe, and along the way starve 30 million Soviet citizens to death in the winter of 1941. They never starved that many people, but the intention gives you a sense of what they intended to do if they could control the Western Soviet Union. So here we see a kind of extreme. We see Ukraine at the middle of unmistakably European projects, at a time when perhaps Europe deserved its good name less than it does today, right? This is a very different Europe. These were unmistakably European projects that put Ukraine in the middle. Ukraine was in the middle of two rival European projects based on global ideologies aiming for world power. Now, just exactly how this plays out in practice is the subject of my book, Bloodlands, which Konstantin was kind enough to mention. But the general outcome, you all know, between 1933 and 1945, there was no more dangerous place in the world than Ukraine. More people were killed as a result of policy in Ukraine than anywhere else in the world between 1933 and 1945. Now, I won't tell that whole story, but within that story of Soviet power, German power, rivalry, and war, there's also a smaller story of alliance, which I want to make sure that we don't skip over without mentioning. The alliance between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany between 1939 and 1941, the time of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, is very important for how we think about Europe today. Or it's very important, to put it a different way, for how people in Moscow think about Europe today. Because the period of the alliance with Nazi Germany, which shows what anti-fascism actually was. Anti-fascism didn't mean opposing actual fascists. Anti-fascism meant strengthening and protecting the Soviet state. The alliance with Hitler, in Stalin's mind, was a way of turning Europe against itself. The idea was, and Stalin was very explicit about this, if Germany and the Soviet Union are allied, then the Second World War will be a war between Germany and France and Britain. And the result of this will be the destruction of Western civilization, the destruction of Europe, the hastening of the contradictions of capitalism to their final collapse. So you see there's a very interesting model here between 1939 and 1941. The model is, you say you're against fascism, you make an alliance with the actual fascists, and you try to destroy Europe. We'll get back around to that. Okay. Now, from here, we're now at the midpoint. From here, we move into a very interesting stage, which begins, well, still before you were born. You're awfully young. I'm now going to tell you something which you will laugh at, and because everyone in the world thinks this is funny. The crucial decade, and the really interesting decade, is the 1970s. Okay, you didn't laugh, that's nice. That's very respectful. The 1970s are, I think, the axial decade. They're the crucial moment that brings us to where we are today. Because in the 1970s, you begin to see a competition between two ideas of integration. A competition which is still going on, but which has to do with, in the end, where Ukraine actually is. In the 1970s in the Soviet Union, there is no longer the hope that Ukrainians will become Soviets and the Soviet Union will be a utopia, right? But there is the idea that Ukrainians will become Soviets. And there is the Brezhnev project of making sure that the Soviet Union just has one humanist intellectual, one humanist intelligentsia, one technical intelligentsia, and that these intelligentsias speak Russian, right? There is the shift away from the Ukrainian language in elementary schools, high schools, and universities in this country. That is one project of integration. And then, on the other side, there is a European project of integration, which by the 1970s has been going on for a couple of decades, which by the 1970s receives a lot of attention in the Soviet Empire and a bit of attention in Ukraine itself. There is a European project which leads indirectly to the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, of which the European states, Canada, the United States, and the Soviet Union are all signatories. 1975 and the Helsinki Final Act is a symbolic moment in politics because here, as elsewhere in Eastern Europe, people seize on to the idea of human rights, an eminently European, also of course American, idea. But less well known is what the 1970s mean for Ukrainians and Poles, and in particular for a particular conversation in which, for the first time really in decades, and arguably in centuries, I would say probably centuries, for some Ukrainians, Poland starts to seem like Europe, and Europe starts to seem like a positive thing at the same time, right? Those are two very important developments. And they begin with a conversation in the 1970s, in which some people here I see took part, centered around the journal Kultura, in which Poles said, we are interested in a future independent Ukraine in its existing borders, right? That is, okay, we're fine, no, we're not going to claim the Lviv. While many Ukrainian intellectuals were moving towards a civic understanding of Ukrainian patriotism, which made it easier for them to talk about Poland. To make a long story short, this meant that in 1989, something very important, a very important success could happen. Polish foreign policy in 1989, when Poland was sovereign but Ukraine was not yet sovereign, could openly declare, we are following a policy of European standards. European standards mean we recognize your boundaries. We recognize your Western boundary. we recognize your western boundary even though you don't exist yet, right? Because Ukraine did not yet exist. We preemptively recognize your western boundary, right? Many preemptive things are bad. Preemptively recognizing someone's boundary is probably good. And this reference to Europe was actually true, because an essential part of the European project is that boundaries are not challenged, right? The boundaries of states are taken for what they are. It's assumed that you can then have movement across those boundaries, and you can create something meaningful in that way. So in this way, something begins to shift. A positive idea of Europe in which Poland could play a positive role, because that's very important, right? If Poland is negative, it's very hard to code Europe as positive. Anyway, that new idea begins to take shape. Now, I'm going to pass over the history of the last couple of decades in Ukraine, because you know it better than I do. The history of foreign policy that shifts from east to west, east to west, east to west. The history of domestic policy, which is an alternation among various oligarchical clans. The way that this ends, I think, decisively in 2013 and 2014 with the Maidan. What I want to emphasize instead is the way that another project has now in fact emerged. So, as of the early 21st century, the European Union seems to be the only game in town. And it is very attractive. It's attractive to a whole group of East European states who join, a whole group of East European states who don't actually imagine themselves without Europe. It's a very striking thing that as soon as sovereignty was gained, the immediate step was to try to compromise that sovereignty. But over the course of the early 21st century, it could seem that this was the only integration project, right? The old Soviet integration project was gone. The Soviet Union was gone. The European project was moving onwards. In the 1990s and the early 21st century, Europe arguably presented, I now feel guilty in front of my American compatriots, but Europe arguably presented the most impressive common market, the most impressive collective, if you like, welfare state that had ever existed. And Europeans had a certain tendency to believe that this was it. This was the only model, and everyone likes us. Now, what's happened in the last year, and here I'm moving towards my conclusion, what's happened in the last year is that something has fundamentally changed. There is now a rival to this project. The rival is not a Soviet rival, and it's not exactly a Russian rival, although it comes from the Russian Federation. The rival is this Eurasian project. And what's special about Eurasia, I mean, both as an ideology, in the words of Dugin, or as a policy, in the hands of Putin, what's special about Eurasia is that for the very first time, someone, I mean, aside from some of my more radical Republican friends back home, someone is treating the European Union as an enemy, right? Someone is treating the European Union as something which is evil and is to be destroyed. Someone is mounting a cultural, ideological, and political attack on the European Union as such. Now, I'm not telling you the history that you already know of the Maidan. You are here. What I'm trying to stress is that this counter-project revealed itself during the Maidan, right? I mean, for those of us who are watching from afar, who were spending the day paying attention to the Maidan and the night watching Russian television, it was very clear that something had changed fundamentally in Russian propaganda. You've all noticed this too. That the Maidan was being treated as aggression from the European Union. Not just the Americans. I mean, of course it's our fault. I mean, let's take that for granted, right? But for the first time, something was being presented as aggression from the European Union. And that aggression was coded in certain ways as decadent, to use the dominant word. right? Where decadent means all kinds of toleration of things that I would regard as essential human freedoms. How you would like to live, and with whom, and in what way. Essential civil rights. So the European Union is being coded not only as an enemy, but as decadent. And this is new, and the Maidan brought this out, because the trend of presenting, this whole trend of presenting, Evropa as Gevropa, which was already there. It sounds funny, but it's actually not funny. Which was already there in Russia, came much more to the fore, because the Maidan was then described to the rest of the world in this way, as part of this offensive of this evil and decadent European Union. Now, this has led to a very interesting sort of dichotomy in the way that Russia's presenting Ukraine to the rest of the world. Because to us in the West, as I'm sure you're aware, what the Russian propaganda says is the Ukrainians are bad Europeans because they're fascists. Right? Meanwhile, although that exists in Russia too, but meanwhile, within Russia, the problem is that Ukrainians are too good Europeans, right? You're too much like Europeans. That's the problem. You're different. You're like Europeans. So there's this basic contradiction in the Russian propaganda. It's a logical contradiction. And of course, it's bound to a political contradiction, because the Eurasian project finds and seeks allies across the European far right. And this is now no longer a secret. I mean, the members of the European far right parties in France, as we see, in Austria, the smaller parties across Europe, Hungary, Greece, you name it, they have all been recruited, and they have all essentially publicly pledged allegiance to the Putinist project. Right? So there is now a kind of fashion turn. I mean, there is now an international cooperative movement of far-right parties, which is basically centered in Moscow. At the same time, everyone is supposed to criticize Ukraine, because Ukraine is too far to the right. So, I mean, all of the European far right is for Russia, and yet we're all supposed to not like Ukraine because it's on the far right. So there's a contradiction here, which I think it's taken us a while to see, but which is very clear. Now, no one in Moscow cares about these contradictions, because they assume that we in the West are simply too slow and stupid to pick them up. And unfortunately, they're mostly right. We are very slow, and we have to be slow, because we're pluralists. We take arguments seriously. We think every argument belongs to a constituency. We have to balance it all out, on the one hand, on the other hand, and so on. And honestly, that's what's good about us. We can't be so quick, because we think that there are different kinds of arguments we have to... But this is actually not a difficult one to think through, and I'm confident that we'll think it through pretty quickly. But the contradictions don't matter. In Moscow, they're perfectly aware that these are contradictions. They just don't care. What matters is that this is a coherent project. It's not at all crazy or irrational. It's not the kind of thing that if you point out the contradictions, it then goes away. It's a coherent project, the aim of which is to bring down the European Union and replace it with an alternative European project, which is where I want to conclude with this idea of European futures, where, of course, the European futures have everything to do with the past, everything to do with the past as it happened, everything to do with the past as we remember it, as we constantly remember it. There are multiple European futures now. There's one European future which is not possible. That is the European future of the return to the nation state. And this is true here, just as it's true in the European Union. In different ways, Ukraine and European Union member states have faced the same situation. You know, or at least all sensible people in Ukraine know, that a strong Ukrainian state, it will exist insofar as it is integrated with other meaningful and hopefully well-meaning entities in the world. This is true in Ukraine, just like it's true in Belgium or Austria or Italy. None of those places are tenable by themselves. This is why the position is the same in the European Union. In the European Union, in the elections for parliament, which are going on right now, big important parties are campaigning on the platform of going back to the nation state, which is a foolish utopia, a foolish self-destructive utopia. Anyone who knows anything about Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, leaving aside the Second World War, but just the 1920s and 1930s, knows how nasty that was, how painful that was, how utterly and qualitatively different that was from the 1950s and the 1960s or today. But that is the utopia, of going back to the nation state. That future is not possible. That is a utopia. That can't happen. What can happen is Eurasia. That idea of return to the nation state, or of a nation state being by itself, and whether that nation state is Austria or Ukraine, leads, so to speak, inevitably to Eurasia. Because the Eurasian project is precisely to make Europe, the whole of it, look like Ukraine does now. That is, alone, without enough friends who understand it, fragmented, intervened in from the outside. That's the idea. What Russian policy towards Ukraine is now, of course it is directly Ukrainian policy. I don't mean to diminish that. I don't mean to diminish your very special situation. But it is also a test case for the European Union as a whole. And in this way, Ukraine and Europe are now bound together, I think much more than Europeans or even Ukrainians have quite understood. There is a Eurasian future, which you can all go into together, and there is a European future, a European Union future that you can all go into together. There isn't anything else. That's what you have in common, right? I didn't have applause written here. These are, I don't mean this politically. This is just a logical deduction. Staying around as a nation state is as much a fantasy for you as it is for the Italians, right? Or for the Belgians. Europe will be together, or Europe will be Eurasia. So in that case, now I really am coming to a close. Ukraine is the European present. We've now reached a point where Ukrainian history and European history are very much the same thing, for good or for evil. The European Union is no longer alone in the world. The European Union can no longer delude itself that it has no enemies. The European Union can lose control of its own references, as is going on in this information war about the Second World War. The European Union no longer controls the history of the Second World War, right? German elites are losing control of the history of the Second World War as we watch. So Europe is losing control of its history, it's losing control of its references. The information war, which is so sharp here, is taking place across the entirety of the West. And it's working better in Germany, by the way, than it's working here. So an entire European order, the entire European order, is under challenge, just as Ukraine is under challenge. Not as immediately, not as sharply, not as painfully, but it is now one challenge. And in that sense, European futures depend upon Ukrainian futures, just as Ukrainian futures depend upon European futures. Thank you very much.
Чи ви мене чуєте? Дорогі друзі і колеги, у мене для всіх є дві новини. Одна добра, інша погана. Перша погана, у нас небагато часу, обмаль. Друга добра, у нас все ж таки є час на кілька запитань і відповідей. На початку я був настільки зворушений видатною подією цього свята інтелектуального, що я навіть забув, як мене звати. Звати мене не Цербер і не інший, не Хронос, тільки Костянтин Цігов. Отже, я буду контролювати час запитань. Я прошу формулювати їх дуже стисло, лаконічно, і ще краще буде, якщо хтось буде надсилати їх в письмовому вигляді. Отже, які перші запитання є для того, щоб сформулювати Будь ласка, пан Михайло Винницький, і, будь ласка, надсилайте запитання в письмовому вигляді, це дозволить нам добре побудувати взаємообмін. Будь ласка.
Можна англійською?
Так.
Mr. Snyder, it's firstly a great pleasure to actually hear what you have to say rather than just reading it in the New Republic, because a lot of things that you said, with the exception of the ending, were previously in a recent article, and that article actually brings two questions to mind, if I may. First of all, the point that you make about Ukrainian history being European is, of course, very dear and very close to sort of the ideology of the speakers in this room, or the listeners in this room. But there is, of course, another historiography, and that is of this idea of Ukraine being part of these three Slavic nations, and this idea of Ukraine, of Ruski Mir, which is, you said that 2013, 2014 Maidan was an opening, perhaps it was an opening or an eye-opener for people in the West, but certainly for people here, the idea of a soft power alternative from the East with its own alternative historiography based on this idea of Kyiv, Magyarodov, Ruskih, etc., was very strong. And so my question, I guess, I'll just limit it to one question. My question is, how do you respond to that historiography? Because you've painted a very clear argument that's based on a 1,000-year history of Ukraine being part of Europe, and there is clearly a very large proportion of the population of this country that would argue that there is an alternative story and an alternative past which justifies an alternative future. Clearly it's not popular in this room, but nevertheless we should have a response to it.
So, when I say, thank you, Mihajlo, but when I say that Ukraine has a European history, I'm not trying to say that that's the only history that it has, right? If just to compare it to the United States, you can say the United States has a British history, right? And that's my preferred paradigm. I tend to think that the United States is really just a kind of extended right-wing deviation from British history. But it also has a Spanish history and a French history and a Native American history. And without those things, the United States makes no sense. It has an African American history. If it was unitary, then we would all have no choice and life would be uninteresting. The second thing I would say is that part of what one does as a historian is one tries to fill in the gaps, right? So one tries to correct where one thinks that mistakes are being made. So of course it's obviously true that there was a history of Muscovy, there was a history of the Russian Empire. In my country, as we tried to understand the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century, what we did was concentrate either as critics or supporters of the Soviet Union on that history of Muscovy, Russian Empire, Soviet Union. That was a very clear line for us. We read textbooks written by Ryazanovsky, which spelled that out for us very clearly. There was this one line of history, and Muscovy was the center. And so, in my own work, being aware of that, I have tried to stress that the trajectory of a lot of the territory that we're talking about, including the city where we're sitting now, doesn't jump directly from Kyiv to Muscovy in some magical way, but also involves the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So there are certain kinds of correctives which are, so to speak, objective, right? That work against some narrative that you think is dominant. The final thing, though, that I would say is that as historians, we are not in a position to tell people in the present what they have to do. We can analyze, right? My analysis was that Europe as an idea has figured in Ukraine in various ways. That it's figured as a kind of typical history that we can look at from a distance. That it's figured as a mode of becoming national, which was typical in Ukraine in the 19th century, and that Ukraine figured in a very, the notion of Europe figured in a very special way in the Soviet Union, an ambivalent way, which is now finally working itself out. into a new ambivalence between the European Union and Russia. It's perfectly legitimate to make historical arguments which stress the other side. That's perfectly legitimate. What's not legitimate is to deliberately leave big parts of history out, to deliberately leave big chunks of history out. So what I'm trying to do at the end of the day is to correct certain things and to point out certain challenges. If I were a big pro-European optimist, what I would do is close the talk by saying, yes, Ukraine is Europe and all you have to do is watch European television and win Eurovision Song Contest, and it will, to take a touchy example, and it will all be fine, right? That's not my conclusion. I'm not telling you a story about how everything's going to be good. I'm telling you a story about how the nature of the European challenge has changed and where I think it is ultimately today.
Thank you very much. Professor Volodymyr Kulik.
Thank you. So my question is, you seem to argue that the Eurasian Union is the most formidable of the rivals or potential rivals that the European Union as a project has. And I wonder why do you think it is so? Why not China? Why not the Arab world? Or why not the Tea Party in your country? Why not something which will not be satisfied with this most enlightened project, most human rights-based project, most prosperous project? So why precisely the Eurasian Union? What is so special about it? Thank you.
Well, there's a difference between opposing values and an actual political threat, right? So it's certainly true that the Communist Party of China espouses certain different values than the European Commission. And it's also true that, to a lesser extent, that the Republican Party of Mississippi espouses different values than the European Commission. Although there's actually much more overlap there than people like to admit. What's important, and what's special about, what I think is truly special, is that Eurasia only exists as a challenge to the European Union. It's a win-loss gamble. It's a big gamble. Because Eurasia isn't something which exists in a stable form over time, like the United States or China. It's a project. It's a gamble. It's a particular geopolitical gamble. And the gamble is, as of fall 2013, I think as a result of Glaziev and his influence, as of the fall of 2013, Russia is no longer content with a pretty good relationship with Europe, right? Not a bad relationship with Europe, and not a bad relationship with Ukraine, right? If you reel back to October of 2013, Russia's relations with the European Union and with Ukraine, with Yanukovych at power, were not bad. It was not a bad situation for Russia, especially economically. That is what has now been placed in the balance. Now, a gamble has been made, and the gamble is, if we weaken the European Union, we're going to end up better than we were in October of 2013. There's no stable point. There's no going back to the fall of 2013. Either the European Union, so now the European Union has basically two choices. It can't just stumble along, right? Either the European Union rallies, creates an energy policy and so on, and then Russia is much worse off. Or the European Union fragments and Russia is much better off. So this is the difference, that it's an actual political challenge, not just an ideological challenge, which it is too, but an actual political challenge. In 2 years from now, we will see whether the European Union, 2 weeks from now for that matter, but 2 years from now we'll see whether the European Union is more or less like Eurasia. I don't think China and the United States have entered into anything like that kind of dynamic challenge.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexei Panich.
Thank you for your impressive presentation, Professor Snyder. And I would like to get back to Putin's strategy, which you present as a direct continuation of Stalin's strategy in the sense of being very anti-European and very actively anti-European, not just to coexist with Europe, but actually to destroy it as a whole. I would like to question it based on the fact that in Moscow there is a very popular idea based on Huntington that the 21st century will be the century of several regional powers and their balances. And in this sense, how far it is possible that the idea to destroy Europe from itself using the right wings is just a threat, not a real strategy. And the real strategy is using this threat to draw a new and most profitable border, most profitable for Russia, in between of those regional powers, seeing EU not as a world #1 power, but just one of several regional powers, with the destiny for Ukraine exactly that it will be not the destiny of Europe. Thank you.
I don't think you have to choose. I think it can be both of those things at the same time. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have a hard time extracting perfect ideological coherence, right? It's not like the good old days where there was a line and there were deviations. A lot of things are said, by Putin, by his advisors, by people who are close to him, and then on television, and together you get a kind of general picture of what's going on. But it's very hard to be sure. All I would say is those two ideas go very well together, because if you think there are civilizations, and you think there's a Ruski Mir, then naturally what you need to do, or what history will bring, is a weakening of challenges to those civilizations. And I think actually, as I understand them, as I understand Dugin in particular, this is what he believes. He believes that the European Union is inherently artificial, right? And therefore, it's not that we're destroying it, it's that history is working itself out, right? Just like the natural contradictions of capitalism were working themselves out in the Second World War, now the natural contradictions of whatever the European Union is, social democracy, integration, they're working themselves out. We may be funding people, we may be supporting the far right, but really we're just giving history a helping hand. We're just pushing things the way that they would be going anyway. So I agree with you, but I just don't think one has to choose between those two ideas. I think they go together.
Thank you very much. Our guest from Paris, Galina Ackerman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Snyder. I just wanted to ask you the following thing. As you just pointed out now, there is no official ideology in Russia which describes what you have described right now. And I agree with you that for many years, long before the Maidan, this ideology existed in a way, and this alliance with the extreme right, for instance, European extreme right, started many years ago. Attempts to discredit the European idea, European tolerance, etc., started well before Maidan. So there is a coherent project. However, there is no Mein Kampf. There is no official document. If you tell somebody what you have just told, many people and many politicians won't simply believe you. I think there is a kind of a very deep lack of comprehension of what Russia represents. And so my question is very simple. How can we convince political leaders that there is this real project to destroy European Union, this real project to spread Eurasian ideals of unchangeable government, whatever, if you see what is Eurasian project right now, those are three dictatorships, clearly speaking, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia. So, how can one work when you don't have anything definite? Everything is very, you cannot say that Dugin is an official ideologist. So how can you work out this thing?
Look, Galia, you're describing the problem of political writing par excellence. This is just the way it was. In 1938, there was a Mein Kampf. And still, the vast majority of Europeans did not understand the threat, right? There was also a short course by Stalin. But people, even people who read those books, often, especially Mein Kampf, would dismiss them for one reason or another, right? So even if there were a Mein Kampf, that wouldn't solve our problems. It didn't solve the problems in the 1930s. It's up to us. I mean, the nature of the beast is that anyone who tries any kind of deductive analysis, which is what I've tried to work out here, that here is something basic, here's another thing that's basic, this is possible, this is not possible, is always going to be overwhelmed by a million signals across the internet now, which emphasize something which is not logical, which is impossible, which is irrational, which is a dream, which is a utopia meant to destroy somebody else. That's the nature of things. We can't change that. All we can do is to try to make our arguments as coherent as we possibly can. That's really all we can do. I'm not sure that you win that way. I'm not sure of that at all. All I know is that trying to make the arguments as logically and honestly as you can is a sort of duty for those of us who think that we do understand what's happening, or think we have a glimpse of it, which is all I would really claim. So I'm sorry I can't solve your Mein Kampf problem for you. But there we are.
Thank you very much. Another question from Paris. What about the United States in these alternative European futures?
The United States. The United States. So the United States needs the European Union. I mean, one of the great mistakes. I feel it's so nice not to be a diplomat because I can say whatever I want. I passed the Foreign Service exam. I thought about becoming a diplomat, and my advisor said to me, he was British, Tim, you have a uniquely scholarly talent. By which he meant that I had no diplomatic skills whatsoever. It's a pleasure being able to say just exactly what you want to say. The United States needs the European Union. I mean, one of the great problems in our society and our civilization has been the artificial distance that has arisen in the last 15 years between us and the European Union, which has had various causes. Most of them, I believe, are fault. How do I see the United States in these alternative European futures? I believe that the United States and the European Union have a natural community of values across the things that I described. I believe that a lot of the distance between us is artificial. I also believe that the distance between us, it wasn't my subject here today, but it is part of this Eurasian campaign, okay, just to take a step up. What Eurasia is supposed to do is to make sure that there is a break between the Atlantic world and the European world, and the fragmentation that I talked about inside the European world, right? The Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel are supposed to become going back to Professor Planck's question, a civilizational barrier. The Anglo-Saxons are supposed to be over here, and then the Europeans are supposed to be here, and then the Europeans are supposed to divide among themselves. So at a higher level, Eurasianism is also about America. I mean, those of you who have read the Eurasian ideologues know that it's very much about America. That we are the source of, all the plots ultimately go back to us, which is, of course, a very suspicious way to argue about the world. So, no, I mean, the way I see it, the United States and the European Union should have better relations than they do. The United States and the European Union are the targets of this campaign. Interestingly, I think thus far it's been counterproductive. I mean, Eurasia has managed to bring I almost said professor, good God, and I'm a Democrat, has managed to bring President Obama's attention to Europe, which is an astonishing thing, like that, and that is Eurasia. I mean, nothing short of Eurasia could have done that. We were doing a really good job not paying attention. I mean, with all due respect to my friends and colleagues who work on this all the time, at the highest level, we were paying far too little attention to Europe, and Eurasia brought our attention right back. Admittedly, we've forgotten everything we learned in the Cold War. We've forgotten our Russian. We've forgotten our Russian history. We've forgotten everything. But we learned fast, and we'll be back. So incredibly, what Eurasia has done is the opposite of what it was supposed to do, at least in the short run. It's brought American attention back to Eastern Europe, right? I mean, as the author of Bloodlands, I can tell you that we forgot everything bad about the Soviet Union in the meantime. I mean, when I wrote that book, one of the things which really surprised me, talking about it in the United States, was that Americans in general had completely forgotten about the Soviet Union. I mean, this is part of our charm. We're willing to sort of forgive and forget pretty much anything. We had completely forgotten about the Soviet Union. We had forgotten about Stalinist terror. We had largely forgotten about the Cold War. And so Bloodlands was presented as a kind of revelation in the US, right? So my point is that America could have safely continued this drift away from European history. Putin has brought us back. Eurasia has brought us back. I mean, in the short run, this has brought us back. There are a lot of people now who are paying attention to Eastern Europe who never paid attention to European Union, to Eastern Europe before. There are a lot of people who are paying attention to Eurasia because they see Eurasia as challenging their own commitments to human rights, whether they care about Europe per se at all. Okay, sorry, long answer to a short question. Am I supposed to answer the rest of these? Okay. How do you distinguish between Ukrainian radical right and the Eurasian radical right parties in Europe in terms of ideology, political, and policy issues? Okay, it depends on which Ukrainian radical right. If you mean Svoboda, Svoboda is one way to distinguish is that Svoboda is no longer part of the group of European radical right parties. Because, in case you haven't noticed, they have all lined up behind Putin. And they've all said that Svoboda, for whatever reason, is not one of us anymore. Another reason is that Svoboda, for all of its manifest flaws, and from my point of view, all of its unacceptable historical references, is actually a pro-European party. Whereas the entire European far right is anti-European in one way or another. So there are certainly some overlaps, but those are the, and there's some overlaps between the Ukrainian right and Eurasia, particularly on issues of family and sexual politics, right? Definitely some similarities there. But anyway, that's how I would distinguish it. Why do I say Eurasia and not Russian? Why do I say the next question? Oh my goodness, Konstantin, you're kidding me.
Sorry, let me clarify.
One question from microphone.
Yeah. I'm Michael Hammerschlag. It's a great pleasure, Professor. Why do you think the Eurasian Union is actually viable? Because really it's reconstituted Russian Empire, and a Eurasian Union would include China, and that could be an enormous threat to the free world. But given the historical conflicts and competition between them, why wouldn't you just say Russian Empire? And another point, completely different point, is I hope you elucidate all these incredible contradictions, because I'm a journalist here, and it's amazing to read the stuff that's printed in the West, because I haven't seen any fascists or Nazis at all. But there are plenty in the east of Ukraine now sent by Russia. And Putin seems to have snapped back to the 70s, where 80% of every word out of his mouth is just complete lies. How does he jump from there to back to the 21st century?
Well, okay. I have a bunch of questions from you. And what I'm going to do is when I have a moment, I'm going to write an answer to all of them, okay? And I'm going to ask the Mohilanka or someone to post the answer, because you've asked a lot of nice questions here, and I don't have the time to respond to them. On this question, yes and no. They are children of the 1970s. It's clear that Putin, Lukashenko, a lot of different people, it's clear that they do have certain convictions that go beyond propaganda, that go beyond self-delusion, that I think they really believe. And they come not from the Great Fatherland War itself. They come from the Brezhnevian recreation of the Great Fatherland War. The commemoration of the Second World War by people who actually didn't take part in it, really. That was sort of Brezhnev's specialty. The simplification of the Great Fatherland War as an essentially Russian effort. I think that mattered. I think growing up in the 1970s mattered. I think people really believe the things they learn when they grow up. However, these gentlemen are very much in the 21st century, and in fact ahead of everybody else. in terms of certain propaganda techniques. I mean, they are the best, like it or not, they're the best propagandists in the world. And by a long shot, right? And the techniques that they use, both the psychological techniques, the way they get into the back of people's brains, and also the simple technology, they're really in the 21st century. They make us look 19th century in their propaganda. They're very postmodern, right? Their indifference to contradiction, right? The completely shameless way that you can say Ukrainians are fascists, but Hitler wasn't such a bad guy, right? With no shame about that at all. The way that they're postmodern also in the way that they treat the 20th century. I mean, in this way, the European Union is very kind of steadfastly modern. America's like this too. We look at history, we learn certain lessons, and that's it, okay? So we learn a lesson, for example, about the Holocaust, and then we try to make sure, for worse ways, better ways, but we try to make sure that things don't happen like that again. It's a very slow-moving, modern way of looking at history. Whereas the Eurasians look at history as this kind of container of interesting things that you can kind of grab from, right? So that today it's Novorossiya, but tomorrow it could be the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. You never know what it's going to be. I mean, the thing I'm expecting is the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? They're on the edge of that at this point. In fact, I think what's going to happen next in Russia, and this is only half meant as a joke, is that historians who mention the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are going to be prosecuted under the new law, but politicians who say it was a good thing are going to be praised. I think that's the next sort of fun contradiction we can look forward to. But so they are postmodern. I mean, in a way, they are much more in the present moment than we are, frankly. But how can they succeed? They can succeed in this way. They are a bit like the Soviet Union. They can succeed not by creating something new. They can succeed by undermining the institutions that exist, right? So my colleague Jan Gross wrote a wonderful book, which is not widely enough read, called Revolution from Abroad, which is about how the Soviet Union entered the eastern half of Poland in 1939. And his major thesis, which comes from an Arendtian tradition of totalitarianism, his major thesis is that it's not that the Soviets overpower, it's that they undermine. Right? It's not that they immediately come in and have a better version of everything. They don't. What they're good at doing is seeing how things work and then finding a way to take those things apart. Now, the European Union is an extremely intricate, complicated project. And it has weaknesses, all kinds of weaknesses. And I think the way Eurasia succeeds is not by building something better than the European Union. I mean, I don't think there's anybody, honestly, who seriously thinks, that Russia, whose GDP is, about that of France, and whose trade, foreign trade is about that of the Netherlands, is going to be bigger and better than the European Union in any objective sense. I mean, you'd have to be, well, okay, maybe, I'm sure there's somebody somewhere, but you get my point, that the idea is not that we're going to be the European Union, but better. The idea is that we can make the European Union worse, so that if we stay the same, we will come out better in the end. That's the triumph of Eurasia. It's not a creative project. It's a project of undermining things that are already out there, so that relatively speaking, at the end of it, you're better off.
Thank you very much. Я прошу вибачення. Я можу тільки сказати, що багато запитань, і це дуже добре. Тільки починається конференція «Мислити з Україною», і Тімоті Снайдер запрошує і Америку, і Європу, і весь світ мислити з Україною. І що може ще більш controversial, він запрошує українців з Заходу і Сходу, півдня і півночі України мислити з Україною. Я сподіваюся, протягом цих 5 днів буде нагода висловлювати запитання, думати разом, thinking together. And maybe the last question from Austria, our colleague, and for this evening it will be the end.
Thank you, Timothy, on your great elaboration about these dialectics of Europe and Eurasia. By the way, for the guests coming from Vienna, Austria, I remember the country who won just the song contest. So, thank you. And as Timothy said, it's not funny, but 2 questions, very short. Do you see in this upcoming dialectics, let's call it post-colonial redefinition of the political spectrum, that left and right no longer really exists, that there is no liberalism, conservatism, like you mentioned, the anti-fascism and fascism dichotomy in the 1930s. How do you see the future in that regard? And second question, how do you relate it, your opinion about the future regarding your colleague Immanuel Wallerstein and his road system theory, who actually 30 years ago somehow prognosed a scenario which might fit into this battle of the future? Thank you.
So what scenario do you mean?
Europe versus Eurasia, and a potential new kind of capitalism arising from it. Thank you.
On the political spectrum, I'm not sure how this is all going to end, but it certainly is going very strangely. I mean, one thing which has struck me, as someone who regards himself as being very much on the left, one thing which has struck me is the way that the European and the American left have completely failed to understand the parts of the recent Ukrainian experience which they might have found sympathetic. So Ukraine was governed by an authoritarian kleptocrat who looks like a parody of late capitalism under Marx, in Marxist analysis, right? That one person is trying to control everything. I mean, not just an oligarchy, but one oligarch is trying to control all the other oligarchs. It is really like a parody of Marx's description of capitalism, and yet nobody on the left saw it that way. I mean, maybe 3 people, in the entire West described it in something like this, and that I think was very striking. It's also very striking that people didn't identify with some of the most basic aims of the Maidan as being liberating. The idea of the rule of law, decency, possibility of upward mobility. These are sort of typical rule of law, social democratic, center left, if you like, aims. But almost nobody in the West processed them that way. And then there's a third failure, which is that almost nobody in the West is processing Russia as being right-wing. Even though, from my point of view, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but from my point of view, these various assaults on traditional human rights, as they've been defined over the last half-century, constitutes a kind of extreme form of social conservatism. The notion that states can invade other states, that one nation can decide another nation is not real, that you define the word ethnicity instead of law, right? Which is what this whole notion of Russians or Russian speakers abroad is all about. These are not conservative ideas. These are ideas which come straight out of the fascist 1930s. And yet, they're not perceived that way. They're not processed that way. So there have been, what I think, 3 fundamental intellectual failures by the Western left in the last few months. And now we're all fighting about it. But it's not at all clear to me that the left. I think this has been a kind of, honestly, a colossal failure of the intellectual left on both sides of the Atlantic. And it raises the question of how it can be, how this could have happened. How the left, which is supposed to be cosmopolitan and universalist and identify with the sufferings of others and so on, could have in many cases, including many prominent cases, sided with the kleptocrats, the authoritarians, and the pseudo-fascists. I think that's a very important question, and I think it's part of a crisis of the left, which, if people were honest, we would just describe it in this way. I think it is part of a crisis of the left. It's striking that so many of the people who are sympathetic to the Maidan are sort of liberals and traditional conservatives, or liberal conservatives in Germany or in the U.S. So something is clearly going on. At the level of the politics of Eurasia, it's very simple. At the level of the politics of Eurasia, the assignment of the European and the American left is to criticize the Ukrainian right, not the Russian right. right? You're never, I mean, the next time that you see Die Linke, that's the German left-wing party, which is not at all left-wing at all. The next time you see Die Linke criticize the Russian right, you know, let me know, because it doesn't happen. Their assignment is to criticize the Ukrainian right. They don't even criticize the French right, or, you know, just the Ukrainian right. So clearly there is some kind of weird political program in which the only right wing which is supposed to be opposed is the Ukrainian right wing, whereas the much more powerful and actually, you know, historically significant right-wing movement, which is the Eurasian movement in Russia, goes unexamined, uncriticized, unnoticed. It's just treated as reality. So there is, I mean, I think, Philip, you're right. I think something is going on which challenges left and right. And I think there are going to have to be a few more courageous people on the left who stand up and say, we completely bungled this one. You know, we got this one completely wrong, and it has to happen soon, or else, you know, discussion is going to be impossible, because the discussion of Russia and Ukraine can't be left to the right. I mean, the right has its problems, you know, and the American right has its problems, which I won't go into because that's a completely different subject. But it has its problems with Ukraine and Russia. You know, the American left and the European left have to engage on this issue, sympathizing with people who want justice, sympathizing with people who want the rule of law and so on, as you know, which is in large measure what the Maidan was all about. So I'm afraid that you're right. I mean, I'm afraid that the Maidan, just as it revealed what the Eurasian project was like, it also revealed certain, you know, half-hidden crises in European and American political thought, which have now, you know, come right out into the open, and I think which have to be aired. You know, it's one more way, I think, that the Ukrainian crisis is a European crisis. It's been a crisis of European political thought, unfortunately. European political thought, with the exception of a few people in the German dailies, European political thought has failed to handle this. It's not been impressive. Okay, I'll stop.
На початку нашої зустрічі я згадав улюблений символ Тімоті Снайдера «Криголам». І ви побачили, як він працює, ви побачили, як реально, суверенно, вільно він може долати кригою пропаганди, стереотипів і так далі. І в інтелектуальному світі, в світлі мислення і думки, я вважаю, що він є більш потужним, ніж Містраль. Я дуже хотів би, щоб українці, two good Europeans, висловили щиру вдячність за той жест солідарності і запрошення до солідарності всього інтелектуального світу до України разом з Тімоті Снайдером.
Dear Professor, I know that you are in a hurry and there is a lack of time today, but let me, on behalf of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy community, all our audience and Ukrainian people express you thanks for your initiative for this intellectual marathon and your personal investment in this action, in this event and in this idea. Thank you so much, and let me present you a small gift. This is not які в нас ці чорні схеми. Nothing with garage. It's only a book in memory and from Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Thank you very much.
З мого боку, я хочу дуже висловити вдячність за увагу і за все, що я від вас, від українців, науковців, студентів, сам навчився. Я дякую.